4 flag-draped cases sat on a tarmac this week, while the President of the United States stood at attention and saluted. Hours later, on a different continent, a spokesman for the government responsible for those 4 deaths stood in front of cameras in Tehran and said his country's leadership is counting down the minutes to welcome an American ground invasion. That is not a paraphrase. That is close to a direct quote. Somewhere between those 2 moments, a genuine, uncomfortable question has moved from the fringes of this war's coverage into the center of it. Is a ground invasion of Iran actually coming? What would it look like if it happened? And is either side actually prepared for what that would mean? Before getting into the specific aircraft, units, and strategy behind that question, it's worth being honest about how much of what's being said publicly right now is posturing and how much is real. Let's start with the immediate backdrop, because it shapes everything else in this update. CENTCOM launched a fresh wave of strikes at 5:30 Hemisphere Eastern this week, continuing to hammer what appear to be IRGC drone storage facilities and command infrastructure, part of a sustained campaign that has now run 11 consecutive nights. Footage released by CENTCOM showed large secondary explosions, consistent with underground drone storage being destroyed, following a pattern that has repeated itself across this stretch of the war. Iran posts footage showcasing a piece of military infrastructure, and within days that same facility appears in follow-up strike footage in flames. Strikes have also reportedly reached locations along the Iraqi border, a detail worth noting given ongoing questions about whether Iranian hardliners or senior officials might attempt to flee the country if the security situation inside Iran continues to deteriorate. Now let's talk about this specific policy shift that has driven so much of the ground invasion speculation this week. President Trump posted on Truth Social that from this point forward, anytime Iran fires on a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, by missile, rocket, drone, or any other device or weapon, the United States will bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant, explicitly including targets located in or near Tehran itself. That specific policy, examined in earlier coverage of this war, represents a genuinely new automatic framework tying Iranian maritime attacks directly to infrastructure retaliation inside the Iranian capital. Trump separately told reporters this week that Pickaxe Mountain, the deeply buried facility suspected of supporting Iran's nuclear program, would be hit pretty soon and very heavily, language that continues a pattern of explicit named nuclear site threats examined in earlier updates on this war. Now here is where the ground invasion question actually enters the picture, and it deserves a careful correction before going further. Reporting has circulated this week suggesting the Pentagon is actively preparing plans for weeks of ground operations in Iran, potentially including special operations raids, infantry incursions, and even the seizure of Kharg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal. That specific Washington Post, reporting on weeks-long ground operation planning, is genuine reporting, but it should be understood accurately. It originally surfaced back in late March, during an earlier phase of this war, describing Pentagon contingency planning that involved thousands of Marines and elements of the Army's 82nd Airborne Division being positioned in the region. Whether that specific planning has been actively updated, expanded, or is simply being recirculated now alongside this week's other escalatory developments is not entirely clear from current reporting, and it should be treated as background context on standing Pentagon contingency planning rather than as a brand new decision made this week. What is more clearly current is Iran's own public response to the broader specter of a ground invasion, and Trump's own continued refusal to rule one out. The current Iranian response came from Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei, who told reporters in Tehran this week that Iran's leadership is counting down the minutes to welcome American forces in the event of a ground assault, adding that any aggressive American maneuver would trigger a forceful backlash, and that there are numerous people in the affected regions eagerly awaiting the arrival of American troops. Baghai's warning specifically referenced the risk of any American attempt to seize Kharg Island, a facility that Iran's foreign ministry says accounts for roughly 90% of the country's crude oil exports. Baghai separately claimed Iran had introduced a new missile to the battlefield and said Iranian forces are hitting hard and are prepared for a land war, a claim that fits the broader pattern throughout this conflict of Iranian officials, pairing defiant rhetoric with claims of reserved, untested capability that has, in nearly every previous instance, proven difficult to independently verify. Now, let's bring in some outside expertise on how seriously to actually weigh the prospect of American ground operations, because this is exactly the kind of question where careful, honest analysis matters more than hype. Mike Baker, a former CIA officer who now runs the President's Daily Brief, offered a notably measured take when asked directly about this. Baker said he has never been a big proponent of a ground invasion, but argued that keeping the credible threat of one on the table serves a purpose, even if it never actually happens. His own preferred point of leverage was economic rather than purely military. Choking off the revenue Iran still generates through Kharg Island specifically, he argued, represents the kind of sustained pressure that could genuinely threaten the regime's survival, more so than munitions alone. Baker was careful to flag the humanitarian complexity of that approach directly, noting that severe sanctions and blockade measures inevitably get passed down onto the Iranian population by a leadership that has shown, repeatedly, that it does not prioritize its own people's welfare. He specifically connected that dynamic to the protests that erupted in Iran earlier this year, which he noted were driven substantially by economic grievance, protests that were met with a violent crackdown severe enough, in his words, that ordinary Iranians now have every reason to know exactly what they would face if they tried to take to the streets again, given that they lack the weapons the IRGC and Basij militia possess. Baker's broader assessment settled on a specific sobering point. He worries more about the prospect of American boots on the ground than about the continued air campaign, precisely because it would not take much for a genuinely determined Iranian regime to create serious, sustained trouble for any American ground presence. That assessment lines up directly with the honest capability picture worth laying out plainly. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Iran fields approximately 570,000 active duty troops and roughly 350,000 reservists. That is a large force by any standard, and it sits behind a demonstrated and extensively documented Iranian expertise in improvised explosive devices, a skill set Iranian-linked networks are widely understood to have helped transfer to insurgent groups in Iraq and Afghanistan during America's own extended ground campaigns in those countries. Iran's forces have also shown a consistent willingness to use man-portable air defense systems, the same category of shoulder-fired weapon that prompted a genuine, if ultimately deemed non-credible, security alert at LaGuardia Airport in New York this week, a threat unrelated to Iran directly but illustrative of just how seriously this specific weapons category is being treated by security officials, given the broader security environment this war has created. Now, let's talk honestly about what a genuine, full-scale ground invasion of Iran would actually require, because the scale involved deserves to be stated plainly rather than glossed over. Iran is a country of roughly 86 million people, with a standing and reserve military force approaching 1 million personnel when combined. Occupying and holding territory at that scale, as opposed to conducting limited raids or seizing a specific, strategically valuable point like Kharg Island, would require a troop commitment well north of 100,000 personnel, months of logistical preparation, and sustained supply chains that would need to run in parallel with the naval blockade already consuming considerable American military resources in the region. That is a fundamentally different undertaking than the kind of special operations raids, infantry incursions, or amphibious seizures of specific, limited objectives that current reporting and administration rhetoric have actually described. The distinction between occupying Iran and seizing a single strategically valuable island or conducting a limited raid is not a minor technicality. It is the difference between two entirely different categories of war, requiring entirely different scales of commitment, risk, and resourcing, and conflating the two, treating any discussion of raids or limited strikes as equivalent to a full invasion, badly distorts how likely either outcome actually is. It is also worth being specific about what history suggests happens when a technologically superior force attempts to hold ground against an adversary well versed in asymmetric and improvised tactics, because Iran's own military doctrine appears to have been shaped deliberately around exactly that lesson. Iranian-linked networks are widely understood to have played a substantial role in developing and transferring improvised explosive device technology to insurgent groups during the American-led campaigns in both Iraq and Afghanistan, technology that inflicted a disproportionate share of American casualties during those two extended conflicts relative to conventional engagements. A force this experienced in that specific style of warfare, defending its own home territory rather than operating as an external insurgency, represents a genuinely different and more difficult challenge than anything Iran has demonstrated the ability to do in this war's air and naval dimensions, where its coastal radar, missile storage, and naval assets have been degraded night after night, with comparatively little ability to meaningfully strike back at the platforms actually conducting those strikes. Now, let's talk about the specific aircraft that would matter most if any limited ground engagement actually happened, because the platform discussion here is genuinely instructive about how a scaled-down operation would likely be supported. The A-10 Thunderbolt, a Cold War-era aircraft purpose-built for exactly this kind of close air support mission, remains, by a wide margin, the platform most requested by ground force commanders in scenarios involving sustained close air support against armor and personnel. Its twin engines are positioned specifically so that damage to one does not bring down the aircraft, and its flight control systems carry enough redundancy that the airframe has a well-documented history of returning pilots safely home, even after absorbing significant battle damage, a track record built up over decades of service supporting American ground troops in multiple prior conflicts. Paired with joint terminal air controllers on the ground, whose job is relaying real-time targeting information, distinguishing friendly positions from enemy ones, the A-10 would very likely sit at the center of any close air support package, protecting American or partner ground forces in a scenario like this, precisely because that specific combination of survivability, loiter time over a target area, and a devastating built-in cannon has no real substitute among current American fixed-wing platforms for this particular mission profile. There's also a genuinely interesting emerging question about how newer autonomous systems might pair with a platform like the A-10 going forward. Systems like the Anduril Fury drone, which has reportedly demonstrated the ability to fire air-to-air missiles in testing, and other emerging collaborative combat aircraft designed to operate in contested, GPS-denied environments without requiring constant human control, could theoretically provide an additional protective screen for a slower-moving platform like the A-10, intercepting inbound threats before they ever reach it, effectively creating a layered defensive envelope around a support aircraft that would otherwise be one of the more vulnerable platforms operating at low altitude over contested ground. Whether any of these systems are actually operating in the Gulf theater right now has not been confirmed by any official source, and claims about their deployment status should be treated as speculative rather than established fact. A caveat worth applying to nearly every emerging technology claim circulating around this specific war, given how much unverified speculation has accompanied every other new platform discussed throughout this conflict. Now for the honest, strategic assessment of where the ground invasion question actually stands. The overwhelming weight of available evidence points toward this remaining, for now, a credible threat held in reserve, rather than an imminent operational decision. A full occupation of Iran is not something any realistic reading of current troop postures, logistics, or political appetite in Washington supports as a near-term plan. And the specific reporting about weeks-long ground operations traces back to standing contingency planning from months earlier in this war, rather than a fresh decision made this week. What is more plausible, and consistent with statements from multiple officials examined in this update, is a narrower kind of operation. Special operations raids, a possible seizure of a specific strategic point like Kharg Island, or increased support to existing opposition and Kurdish elements inside or near Iran's borders, rather than a conventional large-scale occupation of the country. Baker's own comments about arming Iranian citizens directly, drawing an explicit comparison to how the United States supplied simplified weapons to the French resistance during World War II, point toward exactly this kind of lower footprint, indirect approach, as the option gaining the most serious consideration among people actually advising on this question, rather than a large-scale conventional invasion. There's a structural risk worth naming directly as this update closes. Iran's own foreign ministry spokesperson welcoming a ground invasion is worth taking at face value as a genuine signal about Iranian strategy, not dismissing as empty bravado. A government whose conventional air and naval forces have been degraded as extensively as Iran's have across 11 consecutive nights of strikes has every incentive to want American forces to abandon the standoff air and naval campaign, where Iran holds essentially no advantage, in favor of a ground fight where Iran's demonstrated expertise in improvised explosives, its large reserve manpower, and its decades of preparation for exactly this kind of scenario would finally give it a domain where it could inflict real, sustained cost on American forces. That is precisely the trap Baker's own comments implicitly warn against: the temptation to view a ground option as the natural next step in an already successful air campaign, when the honest capability picture suggests it is the one category of escalation where Iran, rather than the United States, would hold the more favorable position. Whether Washington heeds that caution and continues to pursue economic and air pressure instead, or whether the political momentum following 4 more American deaths and Iran's own public taunting eventually tips toward exactly the kind of ground engagement Tehran claims to be welcoming, is the question that will most directly determine how much worse and how much longer this war ultimately becomes.